Good morning. Welcome to the Point. It has been a busy week in Michigan politics, beginning with Governor Rick Snyder and his final State of the State address. Just before he went into that chamber to give that important message, he talked with us about his expectations and looked back over the past 7 years. Governor, in just a few minutes, for the last time, you're going to walk through those big doors to give your final State of the State to a joint session. Beyond what you're going to talk about, what's going through your mind now after all of these years, 7 years of being in this office?
Yeah, well, one, I'm proud of what we've accomplished. And when I say we as a state, we've made a tremendous comeback, and that's exciting. At the same time, as you said, time's running short. And the way I look at it, though, is I want to run through the tape at the end of this year. So there's still a lot to do, and you'll hear tonight some exciting initiatives that I really want to push. There's more to be done. Let's keep this up. Let's keep going.
When you talk about getting things done in the final year, it's also an election year, but I was explaining earlier on 24-Hour News 8 about how there are so many members, about 2/3 of the senators that are leaving, perhaps a third over in the House for term limits and other reasons. So there could be some common ground with people who have unfinished business before they leave Lansing, couldn't it?
Yeah, there could be. And election year is usually harder to do legislative things. But given this environment that you were talking about, Rick, I hope there's a real opportunity to say these are important things that aren't things that would make a difference in 2018, but things could be passed and put into law that could make a difference in 2020, 2022, and beyond. And that's one of the messages I've tried to get across to everyone. This isn't just about what you do while you're in your term. How do we set a long-term foundation for success? It's not about us, but we can help the next generation and the generation after to be even better. Isn't that what we always aspire to do with our kids?
In really broad strokes, standing here tonight, what do you know about this state, this job, and maybe yourself that you didn't 7 years ago?
How well we can work together. Michigan was broken. When I started running back in 2009, remember what it was like. A lot of us don't even want to remember what it was like. Look at where we are today. Isn't it exciting? We've done better than the rest of the nation by far over the last few years. And it's not just about what we've done in that time period. We've set a foundation to show we can use relentless positive action. We can work together to stay away from the fighting, the problems you see in D.C., and keep it going for another generation to come. This shouldn't be about what we've just done, but we've set a platform for years and years to come and for other people to carry that mantle and to do even better.
Despite the governor's agenda, it will really be up to the legislature as to what gets done in this important election year. We sat down with the Senate Majority Leader, Republican Arlen Meekhoff, to find out what was on his mind. What was your take on what Governor Snyder had to say when he took to the chamber Tuesday night?
Well, I think it was great that he actually took a bit of a victory lap. I've been proud to serve with him through the era of when we've been very, very challenged as a state in 2008 and 9 and to now. And you may disagree with the tactics on which were able to arrive where we are, but no one can say we're worse. We are much better off, and we are on the top of a lot of lists that we were on the bottom of before. Michigan is, as the governor pointed out by Wall Street Journal articles, reported in 2009 to be the poster child for how not to do things, and now in 2017, this is the way you fix it. And very proud to serve with him. And I'm glad he took time to explain the past so that we can appreciate where we're going to go in the future.
And as he pointed out, it hasn't been a straight line. I mean, there are pitfalls along the way, which you can point back to the dire straits the state was in back in the mid-2000s, and it would be hard to find a straight line out of that type of thing. But right. The question that I've asked is, has this legislature, has this administration dealt with some of the systemic problems that kept giving us boom and bust, largely connected to the auto industry? That was at least partially true back in the 2000s, although the economy as a whole was in the tank. Are we more sustainable from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, there's different businesses here, more diversified than just the auto industry. And you mentioned taking on some systemic problems, bankruptcy in Detroit, teacher pensions, how we're going to solve that hole and stop digging the hole there. Taking on some very, very difficult things to fix it for the future. And I think the governor mentioned some $20 billion that we've taken off the books of debt, and we still have more to do, but we're not adding to it anymore. We're actually figuring out how to pay the rest of it off. And that bodes well for our kids and our grandkids.
The governor talked about several important initiatives. I've talked with some Democrats who say, hey, I like the sound of that. I like, particularly when you're talking about the environment, when you're talking about Asian carp, when you're talking about more money for schools and some of those things. The reality is, he is the governor of the state of Michigan. You are the Senate Majority Leader. Between the two of you, you have much more impact on what legislation gets introduced, when it gets introduced, the form in which it gets introduced, and what happens to it after it gets introduced. So how much of what he talked about is what you're going to be talking about in that chamber up there?
Well, he'll do his budget presentations and his special messages starting next week and budget the week after. And as we always do, we go to appropriations and we look at all the things that we have to fund. We fund our priorities. We figure out what is it that the public is in need of and what do we see as the path to keep Michigan going in that way. And some of those things we will agree with the governor, probably many of them. I don't think all of them. It's just like any family. You don't sit around the kitchen table and everybody agree on every single thing. But as is in the past, we'll find a way to make the budget work, funding our priorities, and it'll be on time, no smoke and mirrors, and because the public depends on it.
Once the budget is done, I always say now that that should be first, second week of June. That's at least been what we have seen
Typically.
over the past several years. Is the legislative session over until lame duck? I mean, it's an election year. There'll be a bunch of folks. Now, in your case, like 2/3 of your members in the Senate aren't running for re-election.
Correct.
But nonetheless, there'll be a lot of folks out wanting to campaign. Traditionally, during an election year, there's not a lot of activity in the legislature, at least in the summer, early fall.
Well, we schedule a few days in between there because there are likely some things that we didn't do correctly, may have to come in and do some correction. But a lot of the summer will be spent campaigning. After the primary, we'll be back for a month or 6 weeks, and they'll be campaigning again, up till the November election and then lame duck after that. So there's typically less session days in election year.
I don't want to talk or think about this lame duck session just yet, but we'll get to that later this year. I do want to ask you about one thing. You talked about getting along with the governor, and you've always described that as a good relationship. That you've been able to talk with him. But for one of the few times that anybody can remember, your chamber unanimously overrode a veto of his in recent weeks. Did that change that calculus, or is that just how we do business? I mean, that's clearly how the Constitution is written.
Well, again, it's a good lesson in our representative republic, how things work. Each branch has their check and balance on the other one, and we believe this was the right way to do this for the public, including other tax reform that we think is important. We have our role in that as well. And yeah, the governor wasn't happy about it, but again, you're putting money back in people's pockets. And to me, it was a fairness issue, especially on the sales tax on the difference for autos. You've already paid sales tax on the vehicle you own. And when you traded it in, you're paying sales tax all the way up and down instead of just the difference on the new vehicle. And again, it's a fairness thing. And I think in our tax policy and the things that we put together, we believe money put back in their pockets, their money, is spent better than we spend it.
Also on Senator Meekhoff's agenda is doing away with prevailing wage, and that could be an interesting battle in Lansing. We'll follow that. And when we come back, a Democratic perspective next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Representative David LeGrand is a Democrat from Grand Rapids. We talked with him after the governor's State of the State message to see what he thought about what the governor had to say and what he would like to see done in the legislature this year. The governor, in his final State of the State, laid out several agenda items. What was your takeaway? Because I noticed in your release afterwards, you had a different vision of the state of Michigan.
Well, I think what I'll say is this, to put it positively, I think all of the things that Governor Snyder laid out as forward-looking items I agreed with, and some of it I was pretty excited about. I'm excited that he's really thinking about committing to environmental cleanups, for example. I am always concerned about the fact that one of the things that I think we've got two big problems in America, and I think that the governor touched one of them, and I was very happy to hear him say it when he said, any candidate who campaigns and says they're going to fight, you should not vote for. I liked his emphasis on civility, because I think that that's a big problem in America right now. I think that if we stop talking to each other, we're going to stop having a republic, and I think that that's a very dangerous issue. I think the other real issue in America right now that we've got to be concerned about is the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And I think that often in Grand Rapids, you can tell a tale of two cities. People who see the breweries and the new development see Grand Rapids as rising. On the other hand, if you work in our school system and know that 90% of our kids qualify for free and reduced lunch, and you see the ongoing poverty in a significant portion of my district, you've got concerns about how those people are going to make it. And a rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all boats. It depends on how you craft your policy and whether you're willing to commit to helping everyone succeed. And so my concern is that we're honest about some of these stories. So, for example, the governor said, it's great that housing price values have risen 73% or something, he said. Well, that's great if you already own a house. It's not great if you're a renter, because it means your rental costs are going to go up proportionally. I mean, it's basic economics. So if your rent costs go up 73% and your income didn't go up 73%, you have a housing crisis. And we have a real housing crisis in Grand Rapids right now. We have an affordable housing crisis. And we have to really bring some energy to bear and some honesty to bear on how we can have affordable housing, the living wage issue, and whether people really can afford to live in our cities and in our state. And I think that those are issues we have to be honest about. And I absolutely applaud his commitment to talent attraction and retention. That's critical. I think we have to have an honest conversation about whether we're really committed to our universities and our skilled trade programs. I think that all kinds of studies show that investment in our colleges and universities pays incredibly good dividends. And it's not as simple as whether or not these colleges are educating people. The University of Michigan, for example, does a whole lot of R&D work. They do a whole lot of tech stuff. And so they're a part of our economy. And supporting that part of our economy, if we really want to compete with California, Massachusetts, New York, other successful states, we're going to have to invest in expertise and very high-level educational institutions, and we've been lagging on that. So saying you're committed to something is a lot. You always got to ask where the beef is, where the actual money is going.
You covered a lot of ground. I want to go back to where you're talking about affordable housing, because there is no question that if I am a renter and if I have rented a facility, a house that I can afford or think I can afford, and the price of that rent continues to go up, that does create a problem. On the other hand, how do you counter that? Because you certainly wouldn't suggest that it would be better if your value of your house went down. That's not favorable either. So how do you get to that point where you can have some type of stable, affordable housing and still have a robust housing market?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple answers to that. One is we don't want to discourage investment in new build. And I think that's probably a discussion at the local level often, but I am absolutely in favor of density in places like Grand Rapids. Like, we have a lot of empty land that we can be putting more housing on. We don't want to have barriers to building housing that's affordable. So often when we say affordable housing, we're not really examining how much does it cost per unit to make these places. And I think we have to be willing to have units that are less expensive to build be okay to put in the city, for example. That's one thing you can do. I think it's also important that we have supports for people. I'm a free enterprise guy at heart, and I think that one of the things that we have to do then is let people go out into the market and find the housing that works for them, but then give them supports to make the gap, if there is a gap, between their income and the cost of the housing. And actually, our very poorly named homestead property tax credit, just so everyone who's watching this knows, renters can get that credit, and it can make a big difference in terms of affordable housing. I think publicizing available help is important, and I certainly applaud the governor for actually expanding that affordable housing credit. So I'm in favor of credits that will help people make the gap, but I think we also have to talk about it, and we can't talk about rising costs of housing as though they're some unmixed benefit. It is good to have a robust and strong housing market because it encourages more build, but it's also true that if we've got an affordability gap, we have to be honest about it.
Let's talk about the higher education component, because I have heard for years and years and years that the state is not putting enough into higher education. At the same time, Some of our higher education facilities in the state seem to have a lot of money. Now, I realize that there are certain requirements that they have reserves, and I appreciate that some of the extracurricular activities don't necessarily go into the general fund. How do you balance that at a time when you still have ever-increasing tuitions?
Well, I'm not running University of Michigan or Michigan State or Calvin College or any educational institution. So, that seems to me to be an in-the-weeds question. But the broad data.
Well, wait a minute. It's not in the weeds, because if you're going to put more, you're advocating putting more state money into these, right? Mm-hmm. So doesn't the state then need to kind of know how they're using that money?
Oh, absolutely. We should hold the universities accountable to make sure that this is a little bit like the question of if you just throw per pupil money at K-12 institutions, does it wind up in the classroom? And we should always be tracking and making sure that our investment in education gets to the classroom and doesn't get diverted into things that aren't helpful to children. Well, similarly, if the state's going to invest in education, we absolutely have the ability to demand return for our investment, for our collective investment. But I think it's also important that voters recognize, and we have a conversation about, for example, the fact that student debt has exploded in the last 15 years or so, something like tripled. And the fact that 20, 30 years ago, I think it was in the percentage of U of M's budget that came from tax dollars was in the 80s, and now it's like 17%. So the actual costs of education have roughly tracked inflation, but the costs to the student have exploded. And what that means is people in your and my generation got a publicly funded education, and we've said, thanks for that, that was great, now let's make the kids pay for it themselves. That doesn't strike me as good public policy. I don't think that saddling people with huge amounts of debt at the beginning of their career is great, and I certainly don't want to disincentivize people from getting education now when it's absolutely critical that people get good educations that will let them be nimble as much as anything else. I mean, when we say prepare for the jobs of the future, let's be honest, we don't know what the jobs of the future are. We don't know how automation is really going to affect the country. We know big changes are coming, and for that I think we need people who are flexible.
And that wasn't all. There was more politics to talk about when we come back. An endorsement for one of the Republican candidates for governor next. To the point. In addition to everything that was going on in Lansing this week, there was a major endorsement for one of the Republicans running for governor. Attorney General Bill Schuette was accompanied by the governor of Wisconsin as he made his endorsement in Grand Rapids. Tell me what brings a sitting governor from Wisconsin to Grand Rapids to make an endorsement this early in the...
Well, I care about the Midwest. I've known Bill for years. I think Bill Schuette is going to be an excellent governor. He's been a great attorney general. He was a great leader in the cabinet for the Department of Agriculture under John Engler. I think he's got big, bold ideas. And I'm pleased. Rick Snyder came in when I did in 2010. He's done a lot to move the state forward. It was heading in the wrong direction years ago. But I look at the next step, and I think Bill's just the kind of guy. He's a proven leader. Earlier today, I was talking to some activists here, and they said, boy, Governor Walker, we like you because you stood up to the big government special interest. This is the kind of guy that will stand up to any interest that's not in the interest of the hardworking people of Michigan. And despite all the good things that have happened, you guys still haven't, in this state, not you, but the state as a whole hasn't recovered all the jobs that were lost during the recession. The tax increase that the previous governor had imposed about a decade ago is still intact. For people here in Michigan, which is important to all of us in the Midwest, this is the kind of guy who's going to stand up. He's a stand-up guy and will take on those big issues to make sure there's more jobs, higher wages, more reasons to keep graduates here in the state of Michigan.
Mr. Attorney General, this has to be a watershed moment for the campaign. You've gotten big endorsements previously, including the President of the United States, but a neighboring governor coming in on not the best day of the year that we've had weather-wise, but what does that do for your campaign?
Well, neither rain nor sleet nor hail will stop Walker and Schuette from working together. And the fact is, it's a big day for Bill Schuette, someone like Scott Walker. And Governor Walker is the epitome of leadership. He is he rebuilt Wisconsin economy and more jobs and more paychecks, and the amount of capital and job creation with winning Foxconn and all these different things he's done for Wisconsin's future. To have him come to Michigan is a big deal. We have two Midwestern guys, two folks. I intend to be Michigan's jobs governor. Governor Walker is Wisconsin's jobs governor. So we're in sync on this, and to have him come here to encourage people to vote for Bill Schuette in the primary and in the general, it's a big day for me.
Mr. Attorney General, you talked to me when we were over at the auto show, and Governor mentioned it just a minute ago, that you'd like to see the income tax increase that was implemented during the Granholm administration rolled back.
You bet.
That would have an impact on revenues coming into state government. How, if you were successful in doing that, do you make up for that shortfall?
Well, I've been an advocate that we need to cut taxes in Michigan, just like President Trump and the Republicans in the House and the Senate cut taxes. And we ought to follow suit on that. And the best way to start is removing and eliminating that Granholm tax increase once and for all, driving a stake through it, which would be about a 10% tax cut for the citizens of our state. We can't afford not to cut taxes, and here's why. We need to build our state and have more growth and more jobs and more paychecks, and most of all, more people. If we don't have bold ideas and cut taxes, Michigan will be a smaller, shrinking state, a smaller pie, and that's not the Michigan I aspire to be part of. Our best days are ahead of us. We need to have big aspirations, and if we don't cut taxes, we'll be a state that we won't be able to compete with the Carolinas and the Texases that are growing faster than we are. This is about winning. This is about keeping pace and making sure that we open schools instead of close schools. I want to be judged by, do we have more members of Congress or fewer members of Congress because we're growing? That's the judgment and the marker I want to have as Bill Schuette as Michigan's next governor.
Nonetheless, the economic strains on the budget are going to continue to grow. There's a promise for an infrastructure spending bill that's going to need more money as it goes forward. And there's also going to be pressure to do more about infrastructure as we start to look at aging sewers and water supplies and all of the other things that we have here. So can you really afford to lose that revenue?
Absolutely. If we can't afford not to cut taxes, otherwise Michigan will continue to shrink. We'll have fewer people, and that's our biggest challenge. So we need to attract talent, and you do that by competing so that the money that you earn here in Michigan, it goes farther, and the government takes less of what you make. It's all about increasing wages and pocketbook income so that people can make decisions instead of the government. And if we don't cut taxes, we'll be a smaller state, and then we'll even have harder problems ahead of us.
Governor, you've lived this. You know what this is like, trying to make the dollars and cents match with the revenues, at once wanting to be fiscally conservative, but you also have to spend money to stay in business. How does that balance?
Well, it can work. It's all about growth. If you put it in the right place, and that's why getting rid of a tax that a decade ago the previous governor claimed was going to be temporary, sold it as temporary. Obviously, nearly a decade later, it's not. I think Bill's onto something here. In Wisconsin, both our income and our property taxes are lower today in 2018 than they were before we started in 2010. In fact, the cumulative impact of our tax reform exceeds $8 billion. So we've done exactly what Bill's talking about wanting to do here. And yet every year we've been in office, we've had a surplus. Why? If you put more money back into the hands of the hardworking people, the hardworking taxpayers of your state and of your communities, they reinvest it into the economy, they put it back into manufacturing and agriculture and industry and infrastructure. That fuels a healthy economy. We've seen it happen so much so that this last year we were able to pass a budget that not only cut taxes again, in fact, eliminated entirely the state portion of the property tax. We were also to make the largest actual dollar investment in the K through 12 education in Wisconsin history. Why? We had what we call a reform dividend. If you push big, bold reforms and you give people more of their money back, it manifests itself in higher growth, higher activity, and I think that's exactly the kind of thing Bill's been talking to me about wanting here. More growth, more people, doing more, having more opportunities to work because there are more jobs and higher wages. That'll bring more into the state's economy, which will in turn help you do the infrastructure and other legitimate things that people want to do in a state like Michigan.
Of course, we've already featured any number of candidates running for office in this important election year. We'll continue to do that, so join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.